Hi folks, I'm International Master John Watson and this is Ask the Master on ICC TV. The main idea of the show is to provide you, the viewer and listener, with a forum to ask questions about chess and the chess world. I'm here to answer any kinds of questions. Typically we talk about openings, we talk about books, we talk about tournaments and players, maybe a little bit of history if we're lucky, and basically whatever direction you guys want to go in. I also have games that are sent me, games and questions that have been sent me, and they've been sent to me by email. This is the best way to do it, is to ask me a question at askimwatson@chessclub.com. That's ASK for ask, askimwatson@chessclub.com. So ASKIMWATSON at CHESSCLUB.com. So and that's really the best way to send things because you're able to pontificate and add your own notes and ask. You can elaborate. Whereas if you put something on the chat right now, here's a couple people on the chat. If you put something on the chat right now, then it's hard to ask a lengthy and well thought out question. So if you want to send me games, for example, and we have quite a few games recently, send them by email. You can also message me, by the way, at ICC. My handle is John L. Watson, one word, L as in lion, JOHNLWATSON. And the fun part is you can ask right now, live on the chat, any sort of questions, and you can also make comments on the chess world or give opinions. You don't have to be specifically questions for me, but whatever it is, make it chess related. So I think that's it for an introduction. And hello everybody on the chat. Let me get to some things. There's one major thing that I messed up last week. This is an apology to Gerben Van Pell. He asked about the step method and sent me an email with a game of his. So we talked about the step method. I tried to answer that. And I cut and pasted the text of the game into ChessBase. In other words, he sent me a game that's typed out, a text kind of format. So I cut and pasted and I put it into ChessLife, which is supposed to automatically translate it into a game. This usually works for me. For some reason this time it mistranslated. So at the end of my version, when I showed the game, my version very unfairly had Gerben making a crazy mistake, a terrible mistake that he didn't actually make. You can go back to see what I said last week, but let me zip through the real game. I'm not going to give any notes this time because you can see them if you go to last week's show and show you what happened. So this is all kind of interesting. By the way, that move d4 really is pretty bad. It's just anti-positional. It ends up messing up the dark squares badly. I don't know if I mentioned that. And we talked about all these moves. White starts wasting time and then exposes his queen unbearably. And now this move knight a5 was just a killer. And white should have gone queen a3 but went queen b4. And in fact, in the game, Gerben played there and won shortly. For some reason, the game, as it was translated into ChessBase automatically, had the move e5, which was really a blunder. And so I blamed Gerben for not making the right move there. But he did, in fact, make the right move. He played d5, and the queen is pretty much trapped. And so white gave up the queen for a couple of pieces and hoped to achieve something. I'll just show you how the game actually finished. Okay, I think he gave up at this point, yeah, because white only has one piece for the queen now, and black has various threats. So my apologies for that. That was pretty silly, but it made him look really bad, and in fact he played a very good game. So let me now do something else that I prepared. Here we go. We've got a question here, but I think I'm going to quickly do something that can be done pretty quickly before I forget, and that's the following question, if I can get the game up there, or the position. Yeah, here we go. This was from the chat from a few weeks ago, so I keep ignoring this. In fact, it's been almost a month. A question from Samaj. Hello, John. Any insight you can provide me on the e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6? Well, I'll just show it to you. Variation of the Maroczy, meaning the Maroczy bind. This is a Sicilian defense. That's what c5 is. This is an open Sicilian when you play d4, and that's called the accelerated fianchetto. And often the reason people don't play the accelerator fianchetto is because they're not real thrilled about playing against the Meroxy bind. We've talked about, this is actually the original name for the Meroxy bind. This is sort of the Meroxy bind proper. We saw it in this pawn structure in other instances, and you can call it the Meroxy bind or not, but this is the one that more or less formally is the Meroxy bind. And then he asking me about this move, which Tivyakov I noticed played several times years ago, actually maybe only twice because I can only find 2 of his games. And he said, any insight you can provide on this? And I think maybe I can provide some insight here because I've thought about a lot of these positions where you play either g6 and bishop h6, trying to exchange off your what potentially could be, well, could be a bad bishop or could just be a bishop. If you play the move d6 or e5, then this becomes a bad bishop. So maybe you're trying to get rid of your bad bishop preemptively. For white's good bishop, because white's bad bishop is this one, running into its own pawns, right? You look at the center pawns to see what's a good or bad bishop. So there's a logic to making this move. But and the same thing is done on the queen side where white plays b6. We looked at some Frenches last week, for example, where white plays b6 and bishop a6, and also in a bunch of different openings he does this, and tries to exchange off this bishop. So the first thing I wanted to say is you'll notice that the one on the queen side is played much more often than the one on the king side. Bishop h6 is pretty rare. And the reason for that is, okay, first of all, what's the negative of doing? Well, the positive is getting rid of this good bishop for white. The negative is twofold. One is that if white takes that, this knight is really marginally placed. Now, it has a point, it can support the move f5. It's not necessarily terrible, but it's really, there are lines in which it certainly can be shown that that's not the best move, and so it does end up being a negative for black. The other problem is that you've weakened your king side dark squares, which means your king might be vulnerable to attack, for one thing. It also might limit your ability to counterattack in the center because it'll expose your king once the center opens up. And by contrast, and maybe I'll just go back and do this. By contrast, if you do this on the queen side, what we do last week, we had this one. There's a lot of different openings where this kind of thing can happen. But if you do this on the queen side, let me just play that. I think Neil MacDonald recommends playing it right now even. But this has the same drawback. It may not be that obvious, but it has the same drawback that you've weakened your light squares. And you've put your knight on the wrong side of the board. It's going to have to be rerouted to get into the center. And so it has some negatives, but the fact that those weaknesses are on the queen side means that your king is not being attacked. And that means that it's acceptable. What you've gained in terms of getting rid of white's good bishop is pretty big, and so what you've lost maybe balances that. Whereas if you had your king exposed over here, then the balance of that trade would be negative for black. And that's what happens when you do it on the king side, and that's why so seldom black plays this. I remember a game, completely different variation, but where black, Ivanchuk played this against Caro-Kann, played a bishop h6 line, and got absolutely creamed right in the opening. This is a world championship knockout match, so it's a very important game. And just got killed because it's just, you're not covering your dark squares and you have dark square problems on the king side. But you know, Tivyakov played it, so you might think it's sort of playable. Well, I looked it up, and yeah, so I don't like these moves very much. Once in a while, it's a good move, but not very often. I noticed that when I looked at this, white has a 71% winning rate against this move and a 300-point performance rating advantage, which is more important. And that's a very, very large performance rating advantage. Performance rating, if you'll recall, is when you take into account how strong the opponents were that were playing the game. So Tivyakov is the only strong player that I saw using it. There may be others, but I didn't see any game by anybody above 2,500 besides him. And even his results, I only found 2 games, and he drew a couple of players that were either 200 or 300 points below him. So, and no wins that I saw. So this, and they were short draws where his opponent stood better. So I think it's a very, very bad sign in practice that it does so badly. And I think even in principle, even though it looks very attractive idea, it's actually, the negatives outweigh the positives. So that's my answer to that. I could show you this game. Yeah, let me just show you this game. Got a few notes on this somewhere. So these are sort of natural moves. That guy's sitting out in the middle of nowhere, which is really a problem. White stops knight g4 and gets ready to castle, because he might want to play queen d2, and he doesn't necessarily want to have knight g4 happen. Now there's a game where Tiviakov played this move in order to give the knight a good square in the center. And you can just imagine here, by classical principles, but even by modern ones, that this is not, that knight's still not very well placed. And white played here, black played here. White just moved up. White's just winning in the center. White's just controlling the center. And they drew at this point. So black obviously offered to draw here to his lower-rated opponent, and white has more control of the center, he has more space, and black really doesn't have anything to make up for it. There's nothing particularly going on here. It's true that's not a very good bishop, but that's always true in these Roxy bind positions. So the computer likes white, and so would anybody, I think, in this position. So that's not a good sign. Now this game went d6 castles, and there's another game where white played queen, another Tiviakov game where white played that way, and then actually took this. Tiviakov gives this, or somebody, I think it was Tiviakov's notes, give this as equal. And I mean, there's an idea. The idea is to take this, put the knight back here, and control dark squares, have your good bishop left. But the reality is white has more space, and I think it's better in any number of ways. You can just play there. The computer even says plus 0.7 over half a pawn, which is quite a lot, and I think that's true, actually. I don't think this is not equal by any means. It's perfectly fine to exchange. Exchanges don't always help the side that has less space. That's a myth. It's often good to exchange when you have more space because it simplifies the way you can win the game. This is something I try to prove in my books, actually, and show a lot of examples of. I'd say that's a pretty worthless rule. You should exchange when you have less space. It comes from the old double E-pawn openings in the Ruy Lopez and things like that, where it was actually kind of true. It's true in specific kinds of positions. It's completely untrue in other kinds of positions. So I don't believe this is equal. In the game, white played bishop takes g4, and he was better anyway. Turned out he was better in this position too. Not a tremendous amount better, but better. And in this game that we're looking at, let me just show you what happened. White protects b2 and protects the knight, and now the queen's sort of sitting out there. That's sort of a trade-off. It's not a bad move, queen b6, I guess. Okay, so at least black's got his pieces out, but first of all, that guy gets attacked. And then white advances in the center. And this is an instructive game because it looks like black's doing just fine here. He's going to have a little bit of pressure maybe on the c file. His queen's pretty active. But white has just more space. This is a basic kind of position with an open e file against a backward pawn there. And there are types of positions, especially if black still has his dark squared bishop, where that's relatively harmless. But this one, it's actually very straightforward. White ends up attacking that square. And black can't move that pawn. Let me just show you how that works. He's already anticipating that that's going to be attacked. White's threat was simply to play here and then maybe f4 and maybe just take that pawn. So let's see how this works. Okay, now you have these two pawns which tend to be weak unless you have a couple of bishops here defending them, in which case they're usually just fine because they're a central majority. But here they're quite exposed. You'll see this in the Sicilian Defence quite a bit, that these are dangerously exposed. Now of course f4 is an idea coming with just winning this pawn. And black doesn't manage to stop that. I guess there was a knight g4 counterattack. But now f4 is threatened again. So he protects f2. Now he's ready to play f4, and there's nothing to do about it. Oh, he unpins first. Sorry about that. Now he plays f4. Wins that pawn, and black had been counting on this little tactic. Notice that's a fork on the rook and the queen. Black had been counting on this little counter tactic, but in fact it fails horribly to this move. Now if black plays here, c5 will win a piece. If black plays here, I think this wins a piece. If black, oh wait, is that right? Yeah, a piece of the queen anyway. And if black plays here, then I think this way, then just attack the knight to get it out of the way. And then the queen will come over here and there'll be some sort of checkmating idea down here, not to mention a big material advantage. Anyway, that's my basic answer to that bishop h6 thing. I don't like it, and I think practice and principle agree with me. So even though Tiviakov, who's a great player, played it a couple times, I don't think that means much. Let's go to the chat briefly, and then I'll get back to answering some chat questions from last week and other things people have sent me. Okay, hi Jordan. Do you know a book that discusses chess style in detail? Wow. I wish there were better books that do that. Of course, the classic old chess style book is Reddy's Modern Ideas in Chess from, back in 1920 or whenever, or 18 or 19 or 20, somewhere, where he talks about the great players up to his time and what their styles were. Oiva's Development of Chess Style is a famous book. I think the real problem with a lot of the few books that have been on chess style is they tend to all say pretty much the same thing, and you might say, well, that's what you say if it's true, but it's not always true. A lot of the characterizations of chess style are very stereotyped. Most of them come from Reddy. Reddy said some things and everybody just repeated them, partly because it's such a beautifully written book and it's such a wonderful book that people were influenced by it intellectually. I mean, the characterizations of Steinitz and Lasker and these things, everybody just repeats them. And when Kasparov did his predecessor series, Plisetsky, the person who wrote all the book actually, who didn't, except for the games and the notes, Plisetsky wrote the predecessor's volumes, and he pretty much copied those old stereotypes too. And Sadie's March of Chess Ideas is a fun book, and it's about the styles of all the great players. It pretty much also sticks to the traditional stereotypes. So we could use a really good book on chess styles actually. That sort of, I've talked some about the subject, how certain players are really badly characterized or deceptively characterized. Andy Soltis did a good job in his little books. He's done a couple little biography kind of books, not really long and not, not kind of popular, but very nice, I think. He did one on Lasker where he tried to explode some Lasker myths. He did one on Fischer where he exploded some Fischer myths. In both cases, things that maybe some people had mentioned. I know I'd either thought them or mentioned them, but were not in the general public in any published form. What would I recommend actually for a book on style? Well, if you haven't read Modern Ideas in Chess, it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. Oiva's Development of Chess Style is okay. A little dry, I think. I'm not totally thrilled with it. Anyway, more people can throw that in there. How about Finding Your Chess Style book? Interesting. I took an online test and it changed every time I took it. What? What are you saying? Oh, finding your own chess style. I see. By playing, and it'll tell you, okay, you solve some problems, and it says, oh, you're a very aggressive player, or you're a very defensive player, or something like that. Yeah, I probably wouldn't trust that too much. And I hate to say it, but until you get to be pretty good, you probably better be a master before you can really talk about having a style in a way. I mean, maybe that's not quite true. You have preferences, for attacking, for example, but in terms of having something that can be discussed in sort of depth. Usually a style is something you develop over quite a bit of time. How best to break down Capablanca's structure, pawn at d4 versus pawns at e6 and c6. Let me get right back to that. Let me look ahead first of all, just see if I'm missing something really important. Oh, we're getting one of those strange side conversations, which is just fine. Chess for Hawks by Lactual is a new move. A new book. I haven't really looked at it enough to know. He says it talks about style. But it's one of my problems with these move-by-move series by Everyman. Great series, really fun. If you want to learn about the great players, they have their games collections basically, which comment on every move. So they're aimed a little bit down in strength, which is fine. And one thing I don't like about that series is I just can't believe how I don't think in any case have I seen it where the author actually looked carefully at a whole bunch of games, not just the famous ones, carefully and thought for themselves what characterizes this player. Instead, they just repeated what everybody else has said about those players. So I think from that standpoint, they're very weak. But from every other standpoint, they're excellent. They're a great, fun way to learn about top players and their games. So, but I don't think they offer much for style. That's another Everyman book, that Chess for Hawks. All right, so let me go back to that. Let me do something before I hit the question about the Capablanca structure, which I've actually already lost. There it is. Let me get to the next question because I want to kind of try to catch up a little. I've had this one on the chat for the last couple of weeks. Colin Craik asks every week, would you be able to discuss some tips or themes in symmetrical pawn structure endgames? And I just keep saying, well, that's such a general question. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer that, but I did say I'd think about it. And I guess what I'd say is that, okay, what he's talking about is endgames where, for example, there's three, in fact, he mentions this example, 3 versus 3 in front of each other. So the first thing you have to understand about those endings is you can't create a passed pawn by just advancing your pawns. If you have 4 versus 3, then, for example, these 4, let's say, versus these 3, well, then if you advance that F pawn and the E pawn, you can theoretically create a passed pawn by pushing the E pawn to E6, and you'll get a passed E pawn. But if it's 3 against 3, you're not going to be able to do it. So you can move your pawns all you want, and they probably won't force any sort of passed pawn or any sort of probably won't even force any concessions if black doesn't have any weaknesses. So that tells you already that it's probably not going to be a matter of playing for massive pawn advances. So it depends completely on what pieces are remaining. I'm assuming there's only one piece or maybe two when you're talking about endgames here, because otherwise you really can't talk about it very much. But I did want to say a couple of things. In general, the classic endgame rules will apply. And classic chess principles that you see in your beginner's books will apply to endgames. So, and he's definitely talking about endgames here, simplified positions, and they very often don't apply to earlier parts of the game. But some things, let me mention some obvious things. The first thing you want to do, you want to probably centralize your king, and you want to advance it if possible, if that's not risky, if somehow the pieces aren't going to be able to attack it. Presumably there aren't many pieces left. So the king becomes worth more in the endgame, as probably a lot of you know, but that's one thing that applies also to a symmetrical position. But assuming you have no special advantages, it's not only symmetrical, but it's fairly even, be very careful about advancing your pawns. Because when you advance a pawn, it can create a weakness. And that old saw about you can't move a pawn backwards really, I think, applies to to an endgame position. Usually it's not that important in middle games and openings. I mean, it's just so position dependent. There are plenty of advances that, well, you can't move backwards, so what? They're just perfectly good. In the endgame, you've got to be really careful. Because if the other guy doesn't have any weaknesses and you've got little holes all over the place, maybe an outpost or entrance squares, also the further your pawns are advanced, they're probably a little more vulnerable too. So be careful about advancing pawns. You can do it, but just go slowly and do it because it makes sense. Don't move a pawn forward just because you can't think of anything else to do, because you'll probably regret it. Obviously, this is a rule that there's plenty of exceptions, but I think it's worth thinking about. What else was I thinking about? Oh, the same applies in the case of defense. You know, you want to don't make pawn moves for the sake of making pawn moves. Maybe the exception in defense is that if one side has the initiative over the other one and is maybe putting some pressure on your king, maybe there's a rook on the 7th or something like that. Let's pretend it's white. Maybe white starts playing f4, g4, f5, g5, brings the king up behind the pawns and kind of breaks through and opens some lines over there. Well, sometimes it's nice to play a move like h5, for example, before white can get going, so that if white starts moving his kingside pawns, you can simplify, get a few pawns off, and that'll really help you draw the game if you're kind of on the defensive. Mostly, though, you just don't want to create weaknesses. Now, after that, it depends on what pieces you have or what pieces your opponent have, and you just use your general rules. If you have a knight versus a bishop, you might try to get rid of the pawns on one side of the board, because if pawns on the same side of the board, the knight tends to do much better with, for pretty obvious reasons, because it can cover those squares, whereas it can't cover both sides of the board. And the opposite true of the bishop. The bishop would prefer to have pawns on both sides of the board, if possible, whether symmetrical or not. And also, it's often good when you have a bishop to try and fix the pawns of the opponent on the color of your bishop. Even that has exceptions, but it's much more true in the endgame than it is in the middle game or the opening, where that tends to be a very unreliable, well, it's not even a good rule at all. But in the endgame, I think it tends to mean you have targets for your bishop, and you can really tie down your opponent's pieces or maybe even win material. Since you can't create a passed pawn, you want to activate your pieces, just like in any other situation. For example, you want to centralize if you have a queen, you might want to centralize it. A bishop, you might want to centralize. If you have rooks, try and get them to the 7th rank. You know, all this sort of usual stuff. But since your pawns aren't doing anything by themselves, you want to pay attention to your pieces. And you want to keep your knights able to be protected. try to keep them away from the side of the board as much as possible and keep them protected as much as possible, you know, by a pawn, presumably, or often, or maybe by the king, or maybe by each other if there's two knights. In other words, you just play normal chess, would be my answer to the symmetrical pawn question. So that's about as good as I can do. Let's look back at the chat here, folks. What do we got here? Okay. Oh, the Capablanca structure. Well, let's just see an example of that. So let's go to Caro-Kann, I guess. Something like this. And, oh, I don't know, maybe this one. And let's say that white retreats, for example, just to get a pure example of this sort of thing. The question is how best to break it down. Okay, one thing is you have more space, so you're probably not in much hurry. It's not like black is, you want to stop these breaks when they're threatened because that'll equalize for black, but usually you can do that. So the natural break for you is d5, but black's whole philosophy is to stop d5, so it's usually pretty hard to do. Even with that move in, it's hard to get d5 in. So you usually use a combination of techniques. You get developed and you try to grab space on maybe the queen side, for example. You try to grab a little more, you just get space wherever you can. And then eventually you get all your pieces set up and maybe play a move like knight e5 and maybe even f4, f5, a break like that. Maybe d5 if it's well timed. Maybe e4, c4, c5, and then maneuver a couple knights to c4 and e4, try to get into d6 with a knight. It's basically you just try to make progress, improve the position of your pieces. And one thing about these e6, c6, they're very popular, especially by top GMs as on the black side of it, who are really trying to draw. But they don't give you that many winning chances against someone who's playing well. And so if you look at the actual results of some of these major C4, E6, C6, I call that a restraint center, by the way. I talk about this quite a bit in my Mastering the Chess openings, this whole idea of the restraint center. It's a popular modern technique to kind of neutralize White's initiative and his space advantage. What I was going to say is that I think practical results can be pretty bad in these lines because you're so cramped, because black is so cramped. Look at that bishop. And so maybe in practice, it's not quite as good as it is in theory. You know, this example in the French, someone asked about the other day, well, quite some time ago, but it was to do with this Fort Knox variation where you play like this. And then what often happens here is that, I'll just make some moves. I'm not saying these are best moves, but what often happens is that at some point, black plays captures here and gives white the two bishops. That also happens in the Scandinavian, where you get that pawn structure and you give up the bishop pair. And that's been pretty popular. I remember Kamsky playing this way, and well, I mean, a lot of people played this way. Also the Scandinavian defense, you will often get this pawn structure and give up a bishop with bishop g4 takes or something like that. And then set up this pawn structure, which makes a lot of sense because you don't have your light square bishop. Nevertheless, it's the same thing. If white builds up really slowly, rook e1, c4, maybe advances on the queen side a little, black's always kind of on the defensive. So I've never been a real fan of these positions as black. I think in the hands of a master, you know, you should be able to keep things under control and eventually draw a well-played game. I wouldn't really recommend it for learning chess because it's so passive. And it's pretty stereotyped. You're not, you know, you'd have to come up with new, original ideas from this kind of position. And they do exist. I mean, sometimes you do get original positions from this sort of thing. And black has some original idea that works. So, but I wouldn't really recommend it as a way to learn chess and get better. It's more of a professional way to, you know, draw the 7th round of Vicon, say, or something like that. Okay, chess for not that it's a bad structure. I mean, you know, theoretically it's fine. Yeah, it can happen on Queen's Gambits. That's right. It happens on a lot of. Oh, I see. You mentioned that. Caro-Kann, French, Scandinavians, Queen's Gambits. Yeah. Okay. Alan. Now we're talking about London again. The Scots wouldn't take anybody hostage. They just want their independence, or maybe they don't. Edinburgh is magnificent. It sure is. We say Edinburgh. Yorkshire has its charm. I don't know. I was in Yorkshire, but I don't know it really well. I was in York itself, actually. People from Edinburgh are hard to understand, especially when they're drunk, which is all the time. Ooh, listen to this. How do you know we're getting away from chess here? Craig Ferguson and Groundskeeper Willie. Groundskeeper Willie, great. Well, Craig Ferguson is really funny. Yeah, yeah. Scotland's a great place. How about what's wrong with me? Richard Thompson, the guitarist. He's or Kenneth Loach, the film director. He has a new film out. What are we doing here? Lars Bo Hansen's book on types of players. The title eludes me. Ah, good point. The original. Yeah, that's a good question. Lars Bo Hansen writes very well about everything he writes about, I think. There are several books. I recommend everything I've seen, I would recommend as being good. Very instructive books. You might think they were slightly dry, but I enjoy them, and I think he has a real good insight. And I don't know what the name of the book on the styles of players is. King Crusher has mentioned your books in his stream. Well, thank you. I have a few tactical books on the Modern Art of Attack by Hall. Enquist does a great job with Stein and Franco. Well, sure. I think that when some of the specialty books on authors, like I was saying with those Soltis books, if you write a book about a player, some of those books are much better with style because they look carefully at the player and realize that some of the stereotypes aren't really true. Okay, and then we've got some tactics books being mentioned. Wasn't one rule if white moves his f-pawn, you have to move your f-pawn too? I doubt it in a symmetrical position. I really doubt that. I wish I even know how to clear the board here. I think I do know how, but I don't want to try it because I'll probably mess up. Well, maybe I'll try it. Just clear board or something. Oh, then I'd have to set up a position. I think I'm going to skip that. But if you just have these three against these three, for example, and there's very few pieces left on the board, what does f4 threaten? It doesn't really threaten f5, does it? I mean, I don't think it's going to be necessary to play f5 yourself. So I think offhand, I think I disagree with that. I think if white has an advantage and he starts playing f4, you know, if you get g4, if white has some sort of advantage and starts advancing all his kingside pawns because you stand passively and you can't win them or force weaknesses, then it's probably good to, as I say, make a move like h5 or maybe a move like f5. The only problem with f5 is if you're on the defensive and he's got a bishop or maybe a rook on the 7th, or it kind of exposes you more. So h5 tends to be preferable, but that just depends so much on the exact position. Okay, same file pawn. Yeah, g4, g5. I guess I wouldn't say that. I mean, it depends. It just totally depends on the position. It may very well be that if you play f4, f5 is a good move. If you play g4, g5 is a good move, and if you play h4, h5 is a good move. But just depends on the position. All right. What's next here? Now, there's this earlier question about sacrificing a pawn for the initiative. That was John's. I showed a game, Dubov-Tiviakov. You might want to go back to that from Sokolov's book, but I didn't really answer his question. But I wanted to say that the whole topic of being willing to sacrifice pawns, especially for initiative, is something you really need to get. You need to know how to do. If you don't know how to do that, it's going to be very hard to go from being a good solid player to being a master, for example. You need techniques like that. If you don't, you're just not going to beat people if you don't know how to do things that the other guy, you know, isn't necessarily fully aware of, or there's too many positions where that's the only way you can get a good game and put pressure on your opponent. So I thought I'd show another game. Remember I talked about doing an instructive game? And I'll probably get to John's game too, but maybe, I'm not sure if I'll do it immediately, but I want to show you this game because I think it's instructive anyway, and it has to do with an opening we've been studying for the last couple of weeks anyway, and it's a pawn sacrifice for the initiative. This is Artemiev M. Petrosian. I don't know all these different Petrosians, but it wasn't Tigran anyway, or either the two Tigrans. So here we go. Remember that Queen's Indian? So that's one reason I found this, is I was looking to answer last week's question, and I found this game. And then I started thinking about it in terms of pawn sacrifices. So we actually looked at these exact moves, so I'm not going to talk about them. And then white plays this move, which is not the normal move. And I'm not going to go into exactly why that is, but in this game, black doesn't really react in the best way. He plays there. He'd be better off in this case just developing, I think. But this does end up winning a pawn. You're on this twice, and if it can only be defended with this, which is in fact what happens, and then black plays this move, and now this pawn's attacked and that pawn's attacked. So it looks like black's done a really good thing here, right in the opening, winning a center pawn. That should be good, right? But in fact, and let me get to my notes here to see if I'm skipping anything here. But in fact, white can sacrifice a pawn here, like that. Now, if black doesn't take this pawn, which is what he does, he plays here, then he's just got a bad center and his queen's kind of misplaced, and white's going to just castle and play knight c3 and just start pushing his pawns forward. So black, really having gone this far, has to go ahead and take that pawn. And then white castle. Well, actually, white played bishop g5 in this game. I think, yeah, white is also castled in this position. And I think what I'm going to do is come back to that. Let me show you the game first because it's nice and short. Now, the question is, what does white have for his pawn? Well, he's got some development. First of all, the queen is pretty well placed there. This queen is not well placed. It can be harassed. So in a way, white's developed his queen and black's wishes he hadn't. Black also only has 2 pieces out, and one of them is going to lose more time because pretty soon white's going to be attacking that. And white has 3 pieces out and is about to get another one after the queen moves, if the queen moves. So black comes back to save that knight, not to lose more time with it. That probably isn't the best move. It's probably better to go ahead and play here and then come back here. And this is a position we'll talk about in a second because I'm going to show you a game with this that came up by a different order. So let me, in fact, maybe I'll even start with this position, but let me show you what happened in the game. What happened in the game is he decided to get that knight out of hock that way, and then just get developed and be a pawn ahead. And also he's attacking here. That was one of his ideas, to play bishop takes e4. So white defended that and attacked that pawn. And maybe now is a good time to talk about what the advantages are of having given up a pawn. Now the main one, of course, is development. Black's a long ways away from getting castled. And if he has to castle queenside, there's always the issue that he's moved a few pawns already over there. And he's going to have to move his queen to get out of this pin, so he's lost a lot of time. Positionally, there's this d5 square. Black hasn't been able to get the move d5 in, so there's a possibility for white to, white could bring a knight here and have 2 knights on that square. He could play bishop c4 with another knight on it. He could take the knight, eliminating the defender. So this d5 square is a big outpost, which is almost worth a pawn in and of itself. Still, it's a close game. It's a good game still. These are good players. And okay, so black attacks the bishop, and the bishop comes back to attack some of these squares. And this game goes downhill really fast. Black plays a nice looking move, attacking the bishop, but I think he didn't see this. This is what black missed. I think black was getting fairly happy with his ability to consolidate, but that move sort of ruins everything because it keeps him on this deadly diagonal, and it means that moves like e5 are going to be happening with bishop d6. Knight b5 is a huge threat. Castling and knight d5, opening up the e file, is a big threat. And so things have gotten bad. Now it looks like that move is a pretty good answer because it stops knight b5. See, if you play d6 right away, you've got this problem. And I assume that's just good for white. I'm not sure if I even analyzed this, but it looks good. And then white can castle queenside and start just grabbing everything. So he stops knight b5, and white plays, let me see if I have any notes here. White castles. See, just way too much development. None of this stuff is developed. Now the knight can't even go to its best square, and the pawn structure's bad. So you have tremendous initiative for the pawn here, as well as direct attack. So now that was attacked, but this defends it and attacks this square. So, and if black takes it, there's going to be too many threats, I think. Yeah, this is already going to be a threat. Just here, and rook takes, for example, or bishop takes. Bishop takes is even easier. So he can't take it. So he plays here, defending the pawn that way, and white just finishes off the game. He's just blasting away now. This is what happens when you give up a pawn and you have better development, and it's almost like an old Evans Gambit. Now you're blasting open the e file. You're threatening this 3 times. The black takes the piece. Looks like black's winning a piece, but now the queen is attacked. So black has won a piece, but now this check is coming. This check is a threat, winning the rook, and this is this is really just overwhelming. It's just very easy. Show you what happened. He tried to give back the piece, but it was hopeless. I think he resigns already. Yeah, he resigns now because he's losing even more material. So a funny game for someone, this is two grandmasters, and black got absolutely creamed because of that pawn sacrifice. Now let me go back to the beginning and show you what happens in the other line, because I think it's very cute to see what kind of attacking chances, why this is worth a pawn to get sacrifice this piece. Okay, remember we said bishop g5 was the main move. In other games, white had played castles, which is also a pretty good move. And black came back, and now white played bishop g5. So it sort of transposes into that line we just talked about. If black plays f6, now white comes back to that diagonal again. But this time black's going to have a knight on a very nice square in the center of the board is the idea. In fact, that's what he does. He plays knight here, attacking the bishop. The bishop comes back. Why does white have any compensation at all? Well, he's going to play knight here and knight here on that outpost square. And if black ever takes that, he's opening up the e-file against the queen, but also the bishop is going to be opened up after e takes d5. So basically we have what's white's compensation? Development and an outpost. So he's got a positional advantage here. That's a weakness. That f6 square is a weakness. So let me show you how this goes, because this is instructive. Knight here. It looks like black's defending well because he's going to get a knight on d4. And that's not only a good aggressive piece, it's a good defensive piece. White, in fact, just plays here. Black plays here. And it does look like he's kind of defending here. Because that knight's going to stop white from really make it hard for white to attack. So white takes here. But one reason I wanted to show you this is because simplification doesn't necessarily hurt the attack if you have positional advantages, like an attack along the e-files may be coming, the bishop pair, and knight d5 is coming. So white loses time and plays queen d1, I think. Yeah, now he could play queen here. That's not a bad move either. Let me show you a quick sample line here, just to show you the kind of thing that can happen. So black's trying to get kind of consolidated, but white goes ahead and simplifies. He takes pieces off. He's not afraid to take pieces off. Because this is a terrible bishop, that's a weak pawn on our open file. Check. Now he doesn't want to have to move the king, so he goes there, but then the queen just comes back, and now the king can't castle king side, and the queen side's way too exposed. So this position's already very good. Let me just show you an example line. Here's a line that maybe black could try to play here, and then g6, and then here, but in fact it loses tactically, and there's quite a few things that are very similar to this. I think I've got the right position. Oh no, excuse me, that's not right. Rook d8. Sorry, rook fd1. Boy, I'm getting all mixed up here. Rook fd1, rook d8, rook d2, queen c6 to cover that d5 square, rook ad1. And now I think black's almost lost here. It's just too hard to protect everything. But if he does try that to run over here, he runs into a very pretty combination, which is this move. And now if bishop takes, just queen here, pinning the bishop, and that's actually just almost all over. It's just practically winning. But it turns out that rook takes is just as bad because he takes with the rook. Now white's a full rook behind, but threatens bishop takes d6, check, winning the queen. And there's nothing to do about that. And it's also checkmate if black's queen runs away. So that's really it. The only conceivable defense would be making a space for the king, but that loses to this pretty discovered check, winning the queen. So this kind of shows you the sort of thing that can happen because of white's various advantages. And once that f6 move has been played, you notice how that ended up really hurting him. It meant he couldn't castle, and it created a big weakness on d6. But one thing I wanted to show you is how you don't have to keep all the pieces on the board to attack. You can attack with just a few pieces if you have enough good squares. In the game, he played this move, and black played here, and white, once again, just very calmly played this move to get rid of black's best piece. He's not worried about having things become simplified and being a pawn down in the endgame and losing. He's more worried about maintaining his positional advantages, and let me show you how that works. Now this move bishop c4 is an issue, maybe not immediately, but it's an issue to stop the king from castling and to win time on the queen and to strengthen control over d5. So black, for example, if black plays here, then this move is next, bishop here. Notice black can't castle kingside. So what black tries is something a little different here. Black tries something more, he goes queenside, hoping he can kind of hang on over there. But we talked about how dangerous it is to castle queenside generally in chess, and usually it's because there's some sort of pawn break. And you may think, well, that's not threatening much because that's well defended. but hang on a second, you'll see what's going on. Black plays here. These are good moves. The computer approves of most of these moves, by the way, for both sides. Now black tries to expand a little, and then if he develops too slowly, white's just going to break through with a4, a5. That's a big threat, and maybe bishop a6 too. Combine all those moves. So what black does is he tries to counterattack and threaten something like bishop takes or pawn takes, maybe even try and get rid of the queen somehow. And that's a clever move, and it's really interesting to see how white can meet this. Rook here, sort of putting more pressure here. We might ask, well, why is that worth anything? Well, the first point is if he goes there, you go here, and now there's nothing much to do about this. And also b takes c can be good too, but I'm not going to go into that. So the most obvious thing to do is bishop takes. Try to get rid of more pieces, and then after check, just bring the bishop back. And you might wonder now, black's 2 pawns ahead, and the king looks fairly safe. I mean, it doesn't look like there's any way to really get that file going. And in the meantime, black's going to try and exchange off queens. So it looks like things have gone slightly wrong, but this is actually a very pretty move. He can't take the queens off because that's a checkmate in just a couple moves. And if he plays the obvious move, developing and blocking the file like that, then there's one more it's still threatening to take here. There's another pretty move. Rook takes check here, and then one more. There's only one move to win here, but it does win. Now you're down behind material here. So you're behind 2 pawns, and black is threatening queen takes queen, but he's also threatening queen takes bishop or bishop takes bishop. So you might think it's too slow for white to try and attack in this position. There's no good way to attack here. But it's actually a very pretty move. I don't know if anybody, it's kind of hard to see right away, but this little move is very nice because that's checkmate, and that's checkmate here. Minimal material, but still got to the king. So that's extremely, I think we could almost stop here after rook b1 because black really has to move this rook or something and just allow white to smash through. Maybe here, check. Only move would be to make some room for his king. And then a move like this is extremely strong because it threatens queen a5 check. And this is just completely lost. Even materially, it's not that great for black anymore, but he really can't avoid checkmate unless he starts running with his king and then he loses his queen. Very easy to happen, by the way. And bishop d5 is another big threat. So very pretty game. I don't know if you like that game. I think it's a really nice game, and it shows an initiative for giving up a pawn. Question. We've talked a lot about how to improve, and there's so many different ways to improve. One thing I always emphasize is whatever you study, you should study, books or videos or whatever, that you should do what you enjoy studying, because then you'll stick to it. You'll find that you stick to it. There's many different ways to do this. One that you're going to have to play no matter what. If you want to get higher rated, you need to play games. And probably playing Blitz on ICC or Lee Chess or wherever is not going to be enough. Because playing Blitz can make you worse at the same time as making you better. Playing superficially really won't get you anywhere. Nothing wrong with playing Blitz, and you can practice your openings and have some fun with it, but it's not something that by itself is good enough. So you have to play some serious chess, probably tournaments, or very slow online games. And then study what you think is most appropriate. You might look, it's good to get a teacher to figure out what your weaknesses are and what you need to concentrate on. I would say one of the things we said you pretty much always have to do. I don't think you actually need to explicitly work on tactics. If you're playing enough and you're studying enough, you'll learn a lot of tactics anyway. But you have to know your basic endgames. I think that's going to help. It's pretty hard to get to 2000 without at least knowing your basic endgames. You make sure you know those. Don't have to study the endgame obsessively, but although if you like studying the endgame, you should do it a lot because you're going to improve just doing that. You probably need to know something about openings. I mean, basically you need to study. It's actually pretty simple. It's like any sport. You need to practice and study. And you might go back to earlier shows. And we've talked about funny things like playing blindfold chess is a nice way to improve. And there's many ways to approach chess improvement. And I don't think any of them are necessarily better. Nobody's got the secret. There's no automatic way to do it. But if you put hard work into it and you at the same time try to enjoy yourself and play a lot, you'll find yourself getting better just almost automatically. Okay, moving the same F file. Play a lot of games. Yes, I agree. Yes, I think someone, microwave oven. Oh, the stream was off. Sorry about that. My weakness is chess. I need to work on chess. There you go. We'll buy that. Okay, well, no other questions, so let me just keep going here. I don't know if you guys are enjoying these games. I'm trying to find stuff that's particularly instructive. Now there's a couple ways to go next. Let me show the game that John sent before it gets too far away from when he sent that game. This was about giving him a pawn for the initiative. I've also got a game by Bishop Mate that I want to look at. Let me show you this game that John Thomas sent to go along with this question about the initiative. Very nice game, and I think also instructive. It's percentage 305. So we're still talking about pawn sacrifices for the initiative. That's our subject for today, I guess. And he's black in this against an international master. And he plays this move. It's a known sequence. Good way to get an imbalance. White plays the most dynamic move, attacking in the center, and black attacks the knight with tempo. So he gains a little space with tempo. On the other hand, that defines the pawn structure, so white's not necessarily unhappy with this. Now the idea is if black takes this, white takes here, and that pawn structure is very nice for, even if the knight retreats or something, this is a nice English opening pawn structure. So black doesn't want to do that. But that isn't black's idea. Black's idea is to play this move, or sometimes they play knight f6, and get the pieces out quickly, knight f6 and castle. And white plays there and protects his pawn and gets ready to castle, gets ready to get his pieces out. Black develops, white attacks the bishop and stops bishop takes here. He might have been a little scared of bishop takes, giving a sort of Nimzo-Indian pawn structure that he may not have wanted to play as white because it's a static pawn structure. So he plays there. Black castles, good move. He's not worried about the bishop pair. He allows white to win the bishop pair. Now normally the bishop pair is very important, but look what black's gained in. Black's castled and white's a couple moves away from castling. Black has 2 extra pieces out compared to white. White's only got 1 piece out and it's on a pretty negative square. White's got maybe slightly better center. He's got that pawn on d4 controlled, but black's center isn't bad with a pawn on e4. So this position, my guess is roughly even or something. I didn't put the computer on it, but I would say this is a fairly even position. Now, in a position like this, okay, that's interesting. If white plays slowly, either b4 or bishop e2, black can probably get away with playing that move, even though his bishop's on light squares. Black's got more space here, and it's kind of hard for white to break down this position. It's hard for white to, and so black can just play bishop there, maybe bring the queen to the king's side, maybe just play queen d7, eventually maybe play for the move f4 even. So he can also put the knight back and play c6, maybe g5, f4. A lot of good attacking ideas here because of black's space. So, and the same thing could happen on bishop e2. The other option after a move like bishop e2 is just to play normally, which actually I think happened. Oh no, it happened next. Okay, so this happened first, and black has that really nice little central square there. Why would white play that? He just wanted to stop that d5 idea. So now white develops. So white's counting on his bishop pair. This is an instructive game, and black's counting on the fact that in return for the bishop pair, he has a lead in development and a beautifully centralized knight, good pieces, and maybe the prospects also of either breaking up the center or attacking on the king's side. Those are the 2 nice prospects black has. White's behind in development, otherwise probably black couldn't get away with anything. If white had 2 extra moves here, he'd stand really well. But he doesn't, and so he has to face black having an initiative. So he comes back in order to put his knight on a much better square, be able to move the bishop out. I can't believe that's the best move. Probably just this followed by this or something. It's my guess. But I think black's fine. Black can counterattack in the center. It's probably just equal. Because you never underestimate the bishops, even though it looks like black's better here. It's maybe not true. That's awfully slow. I don't like that move. Then black picks a very interesting plan. He could start breaking that up, but he gets more aggressive and decides to bring the queen to the king's side, after which he's really attacking that square and also just attacking generally, as you'll see. Okay, white develops, black attacks g2. It looks very risky to play here because black starts blasting through with another piece. It's like all these pieces, the rook's becoming active, the 2 knights and the bishop and the queen are all kind of around the king. So whether that actually wins for black, I don't know, but it's too risky, I think, for white to play. So white plays the natural move, and here's the point of the game at this point, and it's kind of what I said. If you're here, black is playing an international master, good player, and he's played good moves, and he's got a game, but there's some point at which you have to do something. You have to actually kind of do something, and the things he can do here are things like c6, maybe a6 followed by b5, but he chooses a really interesting approach, which is just to ignore the center completely and play this move. And that's what distinguishes a good player, a master player, from someone who isn't good or really doesn't maybe have a sense of timing or even the knowledge of how to play something like this. And you might say, what is he doing? Well, the first and main thing he's doing is he's opening up this bishop. That's the only bad piece he has. And once that bishop comes in, he can also bring the rook over. The second thing is that even if white takes this, this is an open file, so it could be used later. It may not be a great open file, it's fairly blocked, but it is an open file. The third thing is he's sort of committing white's pawn structure one way or another. For example, if white plays there, it probably has to worry about this move, queen g2, is that right? That looks difficult to me for white, because if he plays here, he's starting to run out of room for his pieces. You know, something like this is starting to look awfully good for white, because now he has bishop h3, for example. So I don't think he can take that way. I think he has to take with the e-pawn, which I think is what he did, by the way. Yeah, and that also gives this bishop a place to go to, so it's a logical move. And black plays check. And the idea now is that, okay, now he pretty much has to take that because this is checkmate. That's a standard tactical position, by the way, a tactical sort of theme that you should know. So he has to take it, and what does that do? Well, that opens up the e-file, and it means that this has become open, this diagonal, which means that this diagonal has become open. So this is what black is doing for his pawn. It's just a pawn right now, but it could become more. He's activated all of his pieces quickly and for the initiative. And so that's what John was talking about, giving up a piece for the initiative. By the way, I'm not saying that white's defending perfectly or that black's even playing perfectly, but it's just want to give you the ideas of the game. Now white plays very cautiously here. This move is just so slow, almost bound to get in big trouble because you attack this with tempo and you get rook e8 in check in very quickly. Let me see if I can give an example. Well, you can't play there because you lose your queen to rook over. So he has to play queen g2. Oh my god. He has to play here. And I don't know. Do you want to play check? You probably want to play check. You might want to play something like queen here, threatening bishop f3. Queen here, threatening bishop f3 or bishop h3. Anyway, it's a huge attack because of these light squares. See, what has black gotten for his pawn? He's gotten... now, when you have opposite colored bishops, in the middle game, it favors the attacker, and the attacker here is black. So that's a pretty good general rule that usually holds true. If there's opposite colored bishops, the attacker is happy, wants opposite colored bishops. And opposite colored bishops, you may have heard, are drawish in the end game, but they aren't drawish in the middle game at all. They're not always drawish in the end game either, but that's another stereotype. Okay, often they are drawish, so I'll give you that. So white is smart, doesn't take that pawn, doesn't open up more lines. That would open up more lines for black. He does take that, he has to, but then he doesn't take queen takes f3, he plays there. And black plays here, very good. No really big hurry here because he's got compensation for the pawn already. He's got what he wants for that pawn, and there's no reason to really hurry because white's going to have a heck of a time trying to castle because of bishop h3, followed by maybe bishop g2, queen h5, knight g4. You know, it might be possible to play this way, but only a madman would even try. So he's going to try and go queenside, but it's going to be hard to go queenside because look at all the squares that are already covered on the queenside. And black can break open more lines on the queenside. So is the king stuck in the center? Well, white thinks so. White tries to castle by hand. Now, I don't think it's the best move, but it's a smart move by a strong player who realizes that he can't just sit around. The best way to do this is just castle normally, just play there, and go ahead and castle like that. But of course, it's very risky because everything's aiming that way against the king, and pretty soon there's going to be a pawn coming up with a rook over here, or maybe even a b5 move, and so I think black's better no matter what here, but at least white's a pawn up and would get his king to safety. He thought he was getting his king to safety this way, but I think John showed a really good way of why that wasn't really true. See, there was no real way to get the pieces out to get the king back, say, over to that square. So what white did is play here to bring the rook into play, and black played that move attacking that pawn, and white defended that pawn, and black checked. I think there's maybe even better moves than that. I think this is only maybe the first move that I think maybe black could have really made this attack overwhelming by just breaking open more lines, because the king isn't going anywhere, and there's going to be somehow d5 and bringing a rook over is going to work, or even b5 is a big move. So maybe that was more accurate, but this isn't bad at all. Oh, a cute idea here. Yeah, that's right. So white takes that, and he plays bishop there, gaining a tempo on the queen before he recaptures. And now he can double rooks. So this is a very strong attack. I don't know if it's a winning attack, but it's certainly very close. What you find in practice with a lot of these initiative games, and I've got a Kasparov game that I was going to show you to illustrate this, is in this case he's got at least complete compensation. He's almost winning. But sometimes you don't. All you have is some compensation, but you have the initiative and you have threats. And the other guy has to use up tons of time thinking about how to fend off direct threats, whereas you can just make natural moves and keep the attack going and open up lines and just keep attacking. So that's worth knowing, that there's an advantage that's not even, the computer might not even recognize, which is just the practical difficulty of finding good moves when you're the defending player. Okay, so there it is, c6. We've been waiting for that one for a while. And now white does something really awful. He should sort of make a little bit of room for himself with that move, in my opinion. And black's still, going to attack and be better, but at least he can try. That's just a little bit slow. All right, so now what's next here? Oh yeah, just because for one thing that's hanging in a lot of lines too. Okay, white tries to, what white was trying to do is sort of block off that queen, but all that really does is open up his game even more. Now this queen is coming on a very nice diagonal there. So the move d5 followed by d4 is a major move coming. It's really, I think, too late at this point. Now there's ideas, for example, of rook takes sometimes and the queen coming in here, but there's also just d5. I think that's what he plays. No, he goes ahead and he takes it. That's interesting. I've forgotten how this game went. So let me just see here. What else do we have here? See what rook takes. Yeah, anyway, and queen f2. It's funny. I saw this game a couple weeks ago. I'd forgotten what actually happened. Okay, so now there's discovered attacks threatened, but the problem is if he moves the king away from the discovered attack, there's rook takes e3, and the king is still tremendously exposed. So very, very pretty game. So he plays king here anyway. I guess he has to. And rook takes on the queen. And queen c2 is a bad move. He should play queen here. You know what all this indicates? Even here, it's possible that white is still defending reasonably well, because after this move, you can probably just come back again to stop the mate. It's very hard to see all this. This is a good example of how defending in practice is almost impossible in a position like this. Now, but just the fact that white can defend here means that maybe a much easier way to win this was to play at some point d5, just break through with d5. I think that would have been a simpler way, maybe with the queen here, for example. Something like this, and just follow with d5, followed by d4, or followed by rook d8, or something. The king is too exposed here. So what he did was really pretty, actually. It was prettier than playing d5, but maybe not quite as objectively good. It's a pretty sacrifice, and it did win. So queen c2 just loses, as it turns out. There's really nothing to do now because black's threatening queen e5. Probably white missed that. So white tries to create a square for his king on a2, but black now attacks the queen, but also attacks the rook down here, and that passed pawn will win the game for him. So white just sacrifices that. If he plays this way, he's going to get, oh, I'm sorry, just rook takes d3, my fault. Well, there's nothing else to do, is there? So he gives up the queen. Now he has two rooks temporarily, but he's losing this rook here, and he could resign now. I don't know if he did. No, he played out for a while, but I think you can see this is just overwhelming materially, and black is going to queen a pawn. So great game, really interesting game with a pawn sacrifice for initiative. Aha, John says that this was based on the study of my English opening books. Thank you. Are there any piece maneuvers or patterns that are well known to IMs or GMs that masters and below don't know? Sure. Well, I don't know about masters. Well, yeah, even masters. Sure, I would say there are quite a few of those. I don't know about picking them out exactly, which ones are known and not known by masters, because I'm not sure. I'd have to almost talk with a lot of masters and sort of see what they know and what they don't. But I know when I'm being a trainer, or even with masters, I show them a lot of things they haven't seen before. So maybe that's a good way to answer that question. So the answer is definitively yes. There's stuff that people don't know, because after all, if you think about it, some peace maneuvers are incredibly subtle and complicated, and the only reason the GMs or the IMs know about them is either because they've worked on that position for a long time and figured out what they should do, or maybe they learned it over the years, because master IMs and GMs have usually seen 5 times as many things as masters have. So they're going to know a lot of strange, funny patterns that the average master probably won't know. So yeah, I'd say yes. I've got a question for next week too. Could you show me a good way to fight against d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3, e6, c3, f5? Okay, so you want to know what to do for white, right? And we can talk about that. It's an interesting opening anyway. I think it's kind of instructive. And then there's a picture of me. I don't know if we want to see that. Don't go there. But we'll maybe after the show. Okay, hey, I don't see any more questions, and I do have more games, but I think they would take too long. It's probably a good time to break off here. Thanks everybody for coming on. I didn't see a lot of chat questions this time. Hopefully that's because the games were instructive and interesting, hopefully. Let me see if I missed anything that I should answer right now. Let me see. I don't really see anything here. You can repeat anything at the last second if you want to. Thanks everybody for coming on. Now remember, ask imwatson@chessclub.com. Send me an email. Oh, and by the way, if you send me games, you know how I messed up that first game, and I cut and paste the moves and put them into ChessBase, but they translated incorrectly. Sometimes the ChessBase is very sensitive to text files with moves in them. So the best way to send me, if you get a chance, if you know how to do it, is send me a PGN file. Not the text of a PGN file, although I can, sometimes I use those. The easiest thing was to attach a PGN file to the email, or attach a CBH, a ChessBase file, like a CBV file, to an email. That way I've got it for sure, and I don't have to copy it or write it or do anything special to it. So that's just a reminder. On the other hand, if you don't have the ability to do that, just go ahead and send me the moves and I'll work it out. It'll work out fine, but it just saves me a little time, and it means that I won't make mistakes like I did with Gerben's game. Okay. Oh, so nobody plays to win that pawn anymore. Oh, here we go. Here's some more stuff. What's this? Are players at the top level avoiding the exchange? Queen's Gambit Declined. I'm always seeing knight f3 before knight c3. Is there a point in the exchange variation that players don't like? And then there's so nobody plays to win that pawn anymore, which is probably referring to something else. I should have kept a little closer track of the chat here. The Queen's Gambit exchange one, we'll do that, and then we'll sign off. Okay, well, first of all, it's a matter of order. Let me show you. A lot of times the Queen's Gambit will be arrived at by other orders, and that's what I think is probably going on more than anything else. An awful lot of the time you'll see that this is the order, and that's why they don't play knight c3, because black's not going to play d5, black's going to play bishop b4 or c5 or something like that. Like the Nibs meridian is the usual thing people worry about. So knight f3 is often played here, and then we get a Queen's Gambit like that. That's a very common reason for seeing knight f3 first. In the actual order here, knight f3. Now, is there any reason not to play knight c3? Yeah, I think some people who play the semi-Slav. Yeah, there are people against the semi-Slav. Okay, this is an idea. If white plays here and black plays this line, for example, it's true that white has one extra option here, but a lot of players don't want to play that. But if they now play here, they allow the no to boom, for example. And that's a very complicated line. Black's playing moves like that, and I can show you that sometime. And even the main lines, white no longer can play knight d2. In other words, positions like this, he may not want his knight already on c3, going into, for example, a normal Moran variation where that knight can be attacked. That knight can be a disadvantage. So sometimes people like to play without putting the knight on c3. Just for example, if he had played knight f3 here and black played, I don't know what, maybe knight c6 or something, and you played e3, you'll find that some people as white like to play this move, followed by bishop d3. Or maybe they want to play b3 early on, or they want to just get castled quickly, just play that move. So that's one thing that's going on with playing knight f3 instead of knight c3. I'm trying to think what else white is trying to avoid here by playing knight f3. I don't think he's really trying to avoid this. People are not that scared of that line. I don't think that's really what's going on, most of the time anyway. Is there anything else? Can anybody think of anything here why knight c3 is worse than knight f3? Except for the Slav lines, I can't think why that would be. It does mean, by the way, that they aren't necessarily eager to get to either this move or this move. It means that they probably don't have a lot of confidence that this is actually better for white. They probably think this is just an equal game that they're not that thrilled with. They'd rather play another version. And one of the versions they might be thinking about playing involves knight f3 anyway. For example, this is extremely popular, this move. Just loads and loads of theory. I've played this myself, actually. And so there, it doesn't matter if you play knight f3 or knight c3 first. So why allow other things to happen? So I think, yeah. So basically, it's not that there's something in the exchange variation that players don't like, it's that they prefer to play something else. For example, the bishop f4 line. Oh, and one obvious thing that I forgot, and I should have gotten this. This is, and maybe someone's already said this on the chat. The most obvious thing of all here I should have thought of, which is this. After this move, g3 is no longer any good because he just takes that. The knight shouldn't be here. After this move, tons and tons of people play the Catalan. So you can't play that with knight c3. You can play it, but it's not very good with knight c3 already in. So this is, of course, extremely popular at the top levels. Everyone, just practically every top player has played the Catalan, and it seems like every one of them has played against it too. So this is something you can only get by playing knight f3 first. So I guess that would be the main reason. And as I say, the second main reason, the other main reason is because so often you don't get that. You get it with this order. So the reason you end up in this position with knight f3 is because white plays it now and then black plays there. So I'd say those are the two things that really I would emphasize that get to that position. So thank you, everybody, and we will hopefully see all of you next week. Don't forget, ask IamWatson@chesslab.com. I can always use more questions, games, comments, corrections, and whatever. And Alan fell asleep again. Well, it's late, so we'll forgive you. Yep, there it is, 12 a.m. Okay, folks, thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.